Hi, Pastor Steve here in beautiful Visalia, California. It's a beautiful spring day here as I record this. You have tuned in to the podcast Scrolls, Stones, and Scriptures. And today we're going to take a look at some really fascinating stuff having to do with the story of the flood. I'll be reading some of my notes because they're extensive about the story and about what scholars of various stripes have to say. I think you'll find this really interesting, especially if you have only ever heard it just as a Bible story or as a children's story. There are a lot of things in the story that make it much more fascinating than just a nice story about animals two by two going on the boat. So let's dig into that real quick. Let me quote to you from a person called Lenley Keep, who works for the BBC and the New York Times. Lenley writes, "Flood stories pervade hundreds of cultures, and there are striking similarities to many of the accounts. It seems that at least some of these stories could be based upon actual events. Geologists have proposed the possibility of a great flood in the Middle East at the end of the last ice age, and that was about 7,000 years ago. At that time, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake surrounded by farmland. The hypothesis is that the European glaciers melted and the Mediterranean Sea overflowed with a force that was 200 times greater than Niagara Falls, and that would be an incredibly fast-moving wall of floodwater. There is physical evidence to support the theory, including Stone Age structures that now exist underneath the Black Sea. Other theories include tsunamis and suggest that maybe comets might have hit and caused flooding also." Lenley keeps her remarks to the Middle East, but worldwide there are over 200 flood stories from every continent on Earth, and all of the flood stories, really without exception, have the main points of the flood story in common. That is that the god or gods got angry at the people, and in their anger they decided to wipe them all out except for the best of them, meaning that there was a hero in the story. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, our hero is, of course, Noah. And that hero is either given a way to ride out the flood. God provides a boat or some kind of elevated hideout. Or in the case of Noah, the person built it. And then the flood comes, and after the flood, effectively the world starts all over again. So you may or may not be aware of that kind of history and the archaeological finds of flood stories in every continent and really from all kinds of disparate places. The question becomes almost immediately, well, what in the world are we supposed to do with that? Does that mean that the Bible is not true? Does that mean that the Bible is true and those stories prove that the story of Moses was true, but they got the other heroes wrong? What does it all mean? It's a difficult part of scriptural interpretation. So what I'm going to say is broad and non-specific, and I hope non-threatening to either Christians or Jewish people or people who don't believe in either tradition. It's just what seems to me to be a reasonable analysis of the evidence that I've presented so far. Everybody had a flood story, right? So what that tells us, I think, is back in the what they call the dawn of time, right? Back when humans were either first fully evolved or were in the final stages of their evolution. At some point when there was language and the ability to tell stories, so that the stories got told through the centuries or through the millennium, there was a catastrophic flood. We know, for example, that the ice ages have come and gone with regularity, and so there would have been many times of massive flooding. And we know that the majority of the world's population in antiquity and clear back to the oldest time up to today, the vast majority of people live within reasonable distance of a large body of water, whether that is a river system, a large lake, or one of the oceans. So it makes sense that catastrophic floods would be a part of the collective human memory. It's interesting that the floods are recorded in all of these civilizations basically the same way, as a response of the gods to what they had created, to the illness or the sinfulness of human beings, and so God decides to wipe them all out and then start all over again. One would think that if you agreed to the historicity of the fact that there were catastrophic floods in early history, and they apparently were regular, that it would just make sense that the interpretation at a time when scholarship or human thinking is thought to have been really based on the idea of a plethora of gods, you would think that it would make sense that they would reason, well, the floods have been catastrophic and chaotic and horrible, and the loss of life was huge, and therefore it must have been punishment for doing wrong. Human beings have ourselves always chosen to punish wrongdoing, especially if it's at a high scale, by the penalty of death or by other very difficult means. So it's just a simple equating in the human mind that when this bad thing happened, it must have been because we were bad. Of course, in the Judeo-Christian tradition and in the biblical record, it jibes with the rest of what will come, which is that sin is the great dividing point between human beings as they were created to be, especially in relationship with God and with one another. And so a propensity to sin and to do evil, which is how Genesis puts it, caused God to regret his decision to create human beings, and he decided to wipe them out, pretty much all of them except for, of course, Noah and his family. So that part of it is interesting to me because it's kind of cool to think, well, we have in our hands in Holy Scripture a historical record that shows what everybody else shows, that there were catastrophic floods, and our people, the folks that we inherit our traditions from, also interpreted the same as pretty much everybody else, right? There was trouble between creation and creator, and so the creator acted aggressively and wiped it all out except for a handful of people or a village, or it varies in different contexts. All of that it isn't rocket science. It's not hard to come to or to accept. I am, of course, avoiding the question of whether it literally happened exactly as it's recorded in the book of Genesis. And again, I am not in that sense a literalist. I believe God inspired the Bible, and I believe this flood and these occurrences where human beings were just getting kind of a foothold in creation and then found themselves wiped out, that was very important in determining the way we understand the power of God and the way we judge one another. But it's not a literal account. By the time it comes to be written in our tradition, we're way late in the game, and our tradition is influenced by some of the other writings that we know, which predate the writing of our story. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh includes the narrative of a great story. The Epic of Gilgamesh comes to us out of Mesopotamian society, and of course that's where our faith tradition starts. Abraham walks out of Mesopotamia and eventually into Canaan land, a whole other area of the country or the world at that time. So he would have grown up with the Epic of Gilgamesh stories. He would have likely known them just as our children know the story of Noah. And he didn't write, as far as we know, but he would have passed those kind of all-encompassing stories onto the generation after generation after generation until they became a part of the fabric of faith and understanding of who God was. So that's the first part. Now, there's some other really interesting, kind of crazy-making stuff that's kind of fun to talk about. In our account, in the book of Genesis, it says clearly that these floods happened during the time when giants walked the earth. Nephilim is what they are called. And it says that the Nephilim, the giants, were breeding with human women, and that was producing offspring who were even more evil than either the Nephilim or the human beings, right? And it's really easy to say, oh, that's just crazy. Surely it can't be like the flood story. There can't be other stories where other societies think about giants, but doggone it if there aren't. Almost as many as other people talking about the flood. So the idea that in history there was a time when the Nephilim, when I guess giant human beings or giant close to human beings were prevalent on the face of the earth, that is well established again across all of the globe in the oral histories of many people. The most understandable and easily relatable for a Western audience like ourselves would be that we have the records of the Spanish explorers, the conquerors who came to the Americas, and when they had taken over the Inca Empire, well, they were faced with monumental buildings that were made of huge stones, much like the pyramid, right? Where they were exceptionally well crafted. And there's no way that they could have taken those stones. And for the Incas who built their temples up high, got them up the hills, and they didn't carve them out of the hills that they were in. So the conquistadors asked the locals, how did you get the stones to make this temple all the way up here? And the Incas answered, we don't know. The Spanish were looking for some kind of technological breakthrough, some kind of what we would call scientific understanding. And the Incas said, we don't know exactly how it was done. We only know that the giants did it. And then after the giants built them, the flood came and killed the giants. That's recorded for everybody who wants to go and look it up. That's interesting, isn't it? So from our hemisphere over to the Middle East, and really in bits and snippets that we have throughout the rest of the world, there is common agreement through the storytelling art that there was a time, let's call it the dawn of history, or even prehistory, since it wasn't written yet, in which giants existed and did amazing things and great evil, and that the floods, whenever those floods came, wiped the whole thing out, the giants and the people that they mixed with, etc. And there was only the regular humans, right? It was kind of the pint-sized humans left, and all of them consider it to be the same thing. Evil got so bad in the earliest times that it was wiped out, cleaned away, and human beings were given a chance to start again. That's the narrative in our Bible, and it, for me, it's just kind of cool in this way. I don't find any great moral truth to it. You shouldn't sin a lot, I guess, but I'm not really afraid God's going to send a flood because of my sin. There are other consequences. But it is interesting to note that human beings, as we evolved and developed into societies in far disparate circumstances and places, we all carry with us a Jungian type of shared memory of a time in the past when giants and floods were, they were the thing. They were pretty commonplace. Within our tradition, then, we borrow or we utilize stories that predate any of Judeo-Christianity's actual traditions, long before the advent of Abraham and the stories that follow. So we become a part of the family of human beings who remember a long time ago and very far away that these things happened. And then within our scripture, then the writers, the people who recorded this as a part of our faith tradition, they make very clear that the link between the event of the flood and the wiping out of large percentage of population, it was linked to God's reaction to sin. In the biblical narrative, that equation then becomes the equation that the rest of the narrative works on. What to do about the fact, and we talked about this with Cain and Abel, what to do about the fact, if you're God, that human beings just continue to sin. They seemingly can't be stopped from sinning. You could kill them all, but if you were to recreate human beings with free will, there would be sin again. So sin becomes the problem because it's a barrier to the purpose of creation. And that's certainly a part of Noah. Now, I'm not going to read the scripture to you. I often do in these episodes, but it's quite long. So I would invite you to go to the early parts of Genesis, look up the flood story, and find out about the Nephilim and those things for your own self. But I will tell you, as it comes to its conclusion, there are some really beautiful poetic touches to the writing of the story. After the flood is done, and Noah and his family have survived and they're on land and they're starting over again. Most people don't know this because we don't teach it in church very often because it's an uncomfortable thing. The first thing that Noah did was plant grapes so that Noah could get drunk. And scripture records that Noah got what we would call, I think, blackout drunk, and laid naked, which at the time the story was written would have been a grave sin, right, in his tent, and that one of his sons came in and saw his nakedness. And there's great argument about what that means, how the sentence is interpreted. It could mean that the son raped the father or was raped by the father, or it's hard to tell what sensibility is at play or exactly what is being told. But there was an encounter of an innocent, the son, with the debauched, the father who's drunk and naked. And in response to that, Noah himself curses his son, and his son then carries that curse. Now, that should remind those who have watched the previous episode of what happens with Cain and Abel, right? The killer is marked by the sin and has to carry the burden of that mark for the rest of their life. So that's another strain that will be developed as the history unfolds in the Bible. Let's sum up, because I'm throwing a lot of information at you. In our Holy Scripture, which I do believe was inspired by God, we have a record that is verified by many other cultures and many other religions that there was at one point a catastrophic loss of life due to flooding. And in our tradition, shared with all of those other traditions, we remember that at that time in history, whenever it might have been, there were also giant beings, and giants will show up again in the Old Testament. But there were a race of giants that were separate and apart from humans, but mixed with humans. The flood killed the giants by and large, and killed most of the humans also. And the heroes of the story, the people who were so good that God decided to start over and to give them a try, they turn out to be sinners also. In spite of the fact that they have watched the consequence of sin in others, they, once they are planted and they're restarting the human race, so to speak, they fall into the same trap of sin. Again, the pattern in the Scripture, in the telling of these older stories, these myths that can't be proven because no one saw them necessarily and recorded it in the way we're comfortable with. The storyline is that the problem has always been and will always be that there is sin in human beings, and it's willful sin. It's not like we go around messing up and we don't know the rules. We know the rules and we do it anyway, and that causes really catastrophic breakage in the relationship between God and human beings. You can fast forward to the New Testament, and you will come to realize that along the path of playing out that basic construct of a theme for our faith tradition, it turns out to be that the answer is not the wiping out of sinful people because of their sin. The answer ends up being to allow himself to be wiped out through Jesus Christ, the Godhead, to be wiped out, to be put to death for the sins of the people, because of the sins of the people, right? In order to bring communion, to give people a chance to be back with God in the right relationship. And that's a startling turnaround from the way the story plods through the Old Testament in a predictable, if you're bad, God will get you kind of way. People say, well, critics of the church say, well, then are we supposed to believe that God changed, that God was a murderous tyrant in the Old Testament, and now he's all sweet and nice in the New Testament? Doesn't that show that the whole thing's a myth? It's just made up. It's just nonsense? Maybe. And if that's what you believe, I'm not likely to talk you out of it today, but let me offer an alternative way to see this. Modern theologians in the conservative Christian tradition, I am a conservative Christian, or at least conservative by today's standards, they note that Scripture is a faithful record by people who have had experiences of God, and that faithful record shows a clear line of progressive understanding and grasping of the truth of God. So the way that goes is this. When the flood came, the best that people could think about God was that he punished sinners by killing so many of them. And that made sense, and that's how they understood God. But as history unfolds and God becomes more personal through the patriarchs and then through Moses and the chosen people and the prophets and the judges and the kings of Israel and then through Jesus Christ, as that personal relationship develops, People progress in their understanding of what God has been doing and what God is like. So progressive revelation is something we don't talk about very much, but we really should, because it opens up Scripture and answers a lot of the critics' questions about the difference, the dichotomy between the Old Testament and the New Testament God. At the point that these stories were first told and passed down and then written, people had progressed in their understanding to a point that God was basically the great rule keeper who came and killed you if you did real bad. They will progress in their understanding of God because they will progress in their relationship of God until they begin to have insights that would be perfectly incapable for the people who wrote the stories to have had. And all of history shows that this progressive revelation, this coming to understand more and more about God, that really is the historical timeline that the Bible follows. So the problem is sin, and what's God going to do about it? How do you stop the degradation of sin in the species? And the answer varies as people understand how to interpret what God is doing around them. It varies from, oh my God, we're all in trouble and God's going to kill us if we keep this up, right? God removes his blessing, bad things happen. It progresses from that to God would do anything to give us the opportunity to use our free will, which is the agent of sin, not to sin, but to be free from the clutches of sin and to be reunited with God. It's really a beautiful story if you see it in that way. Now, we'll follow up, progress with the idea of progressive revelation a lot, because it unlocks the Bible in lots and lots of different ways. We have one or two more steps to go while we're in kind of prehistory, and then we will get to the place that I'm most excited to get to be honest with you, which is the story of Abram coming out of Mesopotamia. That's where there's lots of meat on that bone, and that's where we begin to see our story up close and personal, and begin to have a maybe more recognition than we do in the stories of Nephilim. Anyway, scientists, historians, sociologists, archeologists, they all agree something happened. Now, you'll run into all kinds of people. You may be one of them who say, nah, that bunch of nonsense on the flood thing. There was no universal flood. I haven't really meant that there was a universal one-time flood all over the world at the same time. There were lots of floods, and they got recorded all in the same way, all with the same dynamic, because human beings had progressed at that point only to a certain point in their ability to understand God. The problem, no matter what you think about the historicity of the flooding, it remains to be solved. People did not and do not live the way they were created to live, and God is about the business of trying to figure out how to get that nonsense to stop so that we can live the way we were created to live. I hope this intrigues you. I hope that you find it interesting. I do hope some of it you've never heard before. That's a great joy for me as a scholar to look these things up and to share them with you. And I hope that you will tune in for our next podcast. Again, in the next one or two podcasts, we'll finish up this prehistory time of the Bible. We'll talk again about what happens to the sons of Noah, and we'll talk about the Tower of Babel, and then we'll be off to the races as we enter into Mesopotamia, into recorded history time, and see our ancestor hear from God and begin to walk out. Lots of interesting theories there too. Share this podcast, hit like, and share with folks. Tell folks about it. If you're listening to it on a break or on the way to work or wherever you might be listening to it, please don't hesitate to comment or leave questions or alternate theories if you want to. Just be a decent human being to do that, right? Be polite. It's not a chance to show how cruel you can be or how superior you can be. Be better than that, if you will, lest a flood come into your life. And let's share this information as we go. Again, as we progress in the Bible study, I think you'll find it not only really fascinating, but faith aiding. It will build up and aid and help people in our understanding of God and in our acceptance of the truth of God. That's the ultimate goal. God bless you, and we'll catch you next time.